But real credibility was created on the racetrack. Production racing was at its height, with long-distance events attracting enormous attention and prestige. The Bonneville was about to herald in an era of dominance for the Triumph marque.
This is a 65 Thruxton. It's the real first year of the Thruxtons. 65, I believe they built just over 50, and they built some in 66 and also 67. But it was the start of the Thruxton in 65. The difference between this and a standard Bonneville would have been they're very, very highly tuned, camshaft wise, polishing, jetting, and also they would have had the rear sets on them here. It would have been standard for a rev counter. Also a fairing would have been fitted to them, and also the exhaust systems were different. It had the bigger pipes on.
The 500-mile International in Great Britain was the premier production event in the whole of Europe, and most of the works teams in Europe were represented from Spain and Italy, and it was a big battle between Nortons and Triumphs. The race had been going on for something like, I think, 10 or 12 years, and it was always a great prestigious battle to see who could win.
This is the very machine Chris campaigned during the 60s in Britain and Europe. The Thruxton 500, Barcelona 24 hours, Zandvoort 6 hours, these were races that mattered back then. It was the first time he'd seen his old machine in 30 years.
Well, my earliest recollection was when I first saw it, which was, it had been purchased by a friend of mine, and he invited me to ride it in the 500-mile race in 1965. And I went to Snetterton a few days before the event in order to help run the machine in, because it was probably quite tight. And that was probably, I think, Tuesday or Wednesday before the Saturday event. We probably done, I don't know, perhaps an hour or so of careful running in, and there was an awful bang from the engine, and I was riding at the time, and I looked down the front and got a big hole in the front of the engine, and I was absolutely dismayed because in those days I was penniless, and this was a great event really to be asked to allowed to ride the bike. And I brought it to a halt, and we took it back to the paddock, and my friend phoned Eddie Webb, who owned the bike. He phoned the factory, and it was back there sharpish, and fortunately the factory supplied us with a new engine ready for Saturday's race meeting. So that's my first recollection, was a bit of a horror story. Well, the first time I really rode it was the Saturday that we came to the 500 mile in 65, and I was tremendously impressed. It certainly had more power than anything I'd ridden before, and it was beautifully prepared, and the handling qualities were superb, and it allowed me to ride in the manner that I couldn't have done previously. I was very, very impressed, and I still am impressed with the handling qualities. I'd never seen a rev counter that proceeded round the dial as fast as you could change gear. That's what really impressed me, I think, yeah. It took a bit of getting used to initially, because the power came in at 5,000 RPM, and you rode it between 5 and 7,500 in short circuit scratch racing, and probably between 5 and 7,000 for long distance events. And staying in that band, in that power band, with a 4-speed close box, took a bit of getting used to, really. That's the only thing. If you've got tight corners and hairpins occasionally, you really had to let it drag itself round. There's no good trying to slip the clutch or anything in a long distance race. Well, I couldn't say we really stood a chance of beating them, the works at factories, at all, because their riders were sort of semi-professional people, and they really were out to win. A slightly different standard to us, but I think we did particularly well to stay pretty close to them. It was a good machine to run because it wasn't expensive to maintain. I think you could get all the parts easily, and they were surprisingly reliable. I think didn't get a lot of trouble with them, although if you ran them for a long time, bits would go. And eventually, when I owned this machine in '68, I think by then some of the parts were getting well used, and I did have a bit of bother with it. But after 3 years of hard racing, I think you've got to accept that they were easy to maintain. Well, I rode BSA Spitfires in the 24-hour race at Barcelona in '66 and '67. And I think the difference between the Spitfire and this is really the BSAs were much heavier to handle. Although they stayed on line well and steered superbly, you needed quite a bit of strength to put them into a corner and then picking them up again. And on a very short, well, it wasn't a short circuit, but a very twisty circuit, a very tight circuit at Barcelona. It took a lot of strength to do that over 24 hours. And I found the Triumph was much sweeter. It went into a corner with just the gentlest of pressure and a slight pressure on the handlebars to lift it, and it would come up again, and that was nice. And the gear ratios were better. I think the BSAs never seemed to have a good close ratio gearbox. They had gaps, particularly between first and second. There was a big gap, and often you were waiting for the power to overcome the gap in the box. But these machines, they had beautifully chosen ratios, and they're much easier to handle. Well, I think it stayed quite competitive up until 1968 because the scene wasn't changing, and it was still the production scene was still 650 twins, the Nortons and Triumphs and things like that, and particularly the BSA Spitfires. But I could see that things were going to change because the Triumph Tridents, the triples, were coming into racing, and I knew that this wouldn't stay competitive much longer, and I think that's probably one of the reasons I retired at the end of '68 and then sold the bike on.
Britain's classic long-distance race on two wheels, and the only event in the country that counts towards the World Endurance Championships. The International 500-mile Grand Prix at Thruxton in Hampshire begins with a Le Mans-type start.
But the Bonneville's racing days were not over yet. 1969 was to prove a memorable year. Not only did a Bonneville win the Thruxton 500, but Malcolm Uphill went on to set a new record at the Isle of Man TT. His average lap speed of 99.99 miles per hour electrified the world of motorcycling in a way that seems hard to imagine today.
Daytona, ridden by last year's winners, Peter Butler and David Nixon, coming into the pits. But this year, the winner is Percy Tate on a work-centered Triumph Bonneville number 52, and his partnership with Malcolm Uphill takes the trophy. Their time is a record for the race.
I certainly didn't expect to see it again, and in a strange way, I didn't really want to see it again, because it was certainly my favourite machine, and I wanted it to exist here and not to see somebody else own it. And I thought it had vanished completely and probably been taken to bits and scattered and gone. But I'm pleased to see it again now, really. And it's nice to know that it'll be put back in completely original condition and looked after, because it is a classic machine, and I think it's the ultimate 650. It's the ultimate Triumph twin, because after they went to 750s, they were never quite as good, quite the same. And this is really the ultimate development from right back from the 1937 speed twin.